I think you better find something else to do with your life because this preaching thing ain't going to ever amount to very much. And I said, God is calling me to begin a storefront ministry. But I just heard those three words, shades of grace. And I knew. Nobody had to convince me. Nobody had to argue with me. I said, it's done. When I was born, I weighed 2 pounds, and above all odds, I survived by my mom keeping me in a banana box beside the stove. And they thought there was no hope that I would live, but my dad always said big things come in small packages. And so from 2 pounds up until 11 months, I was diagnosed with a very rare blood disorder and had complete blood transfusions for my whole body at 11 months. And then when I was 5 years old, I fell into a raging stream and drowned. And had it not been for my sister and my dad who brought me up and resuscitated me, I would not be here. So I say I am here because of God's goodness and God's grace. And little is much when God is in it. So from that point in time until now, I have been so blessed to never have spent not even one day in a hospital. When I was about 17 years old, someone invited me to a church revival meeting. Up until that time, we really did not come from a churched family. Occasionally, maybe being invited to a VBS as a child or going to an occasional service, but I did not necessarily grow up in a home that emphasized a lot of church. So at 17, when I went to this little church, there were only about 20 people present, but the Lord dealt with my heart, and I realized then that there was something that God wanted me to do, and I was troubled for months. I remember crying and not knowing why I'm crying. I remember feeling this sense of emptiness and loneliness. And so I began to pray diligently, Lord, whatever it takes for me to do your will, make me to make it happen. And I'm not sure how theologically sound that prayer would be, but it worked in my case. Lord, make my will to be your will. Make me to do your will, because I knew I was being called. And so after a couple of years in that very small congregation, I felt that I was being led into ministry, and so I was invited to a small community church in the neighborhood that had Friday night services. And they didn't have a pastor, they just had people come in and whoever wanted to preach or teach. And so that night, for the very first time in my life, my dad went with me. He'd never gone to church, to my knowledge, in his life. And so when I got there, I'd never preached. And had you known me back in those days, I couldn't speak in front of 10 people or 20 people. I'd rather take a low grade in school than to stand up in front of the class. And so that's where I was on that Friday night with maybe 15 or 20 people. I knew all of them. And I went through my whole sermon in about 3 or 4 minutes, I guess. And I had written pages. And so when I finished it, I kind of recapped it all for another 2 or 3 minutes. And that was it. And on my way home, my dad said something to me that has stayed with me all my life. Because I'm the kind of person who, when someone says you cannot do something, then I'm going to prove that I can. And we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. So on the way home that night, my dad said the encouragement that everybody wants to hear. I think you better find something else to do with your life, because this preaching thing ain't going to ever amount to very much. And I just made up my mind that night that I was going to follow God's call, and doors began to open for me. I began to be asked to conduct revival meetings and gospel meetings. And the Lord just put His approval upon everything that I did. And so through my 20s, I attended college, did some part-time work, owned a business for a couple of years, just trying to find out what God wanted me to do. But in the long run, by the time I was 30 years old, I just kind of left everything behind and launched out by faith into full-time ministry. In 1989, I moved from Miami, Florida, to a place in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia, to a congregation that did not have a pastor. And I had some connections through my travels and some family connections throughout the mountains and throughout the area. So I ended up in that place just as a guest speaker to fill a few Sundays in the pulpit. And I was asked, will you become our full-time minister? And so I stayed there for 4 years. And my full intent and plans for those 4 years was that was going to be temporary, and I was going back to Florida, to Miami, to what I really knew and to the places I know best and the people I know best. But during that time, the Lord did some miraculous things, used me to grow in the ministry. And so up until that time, I had been serving in a Pentecostal church, because that was the denomination that had invited me as a young person. When I was, after the 4 years in Virginia, and I was 35 years old, I guess, I received a call from someone who, well, in the meantime, I was praying at the end of those 4 years. The church had grown to about 120 from about 12 originally. And it was a fairly small town near a courthouse, just a small county seat type town. And I was feeling the urge to go back to the big city. I wanted to go back to Miami. And I was praying, Lord, what shall I do? When shall I do it? And the phone rang in that church one day, and a gentleman whose voice I had never heard, someone I had never met, introduced himself, and he said, I'm a district superintendent in the United Methodist Church. And he said, I have a very strong attachment to this building that you are meeting in, that you've been in for these past 4 years, because it's a beautiful church with stained glass windows and big pillars out front. It originally had been a Methodist house of worship, and they had moved out and built a bigger church in town. So that's how the Pentecostal church had ended up purchasing that for a new church start. And so he said, I've been watching your ministry. I've even sent a couple of spies in to some of your services to give me a report, because I feel like that you'd make a really good Methodist. He said, I'm asking you, and I know you don't know me from Adam, but would you be willing to pray about coming to an appointment that I have that you would just love in the United Methodist Church? And my answer very quickly was, no, I'm not going to pray about it. He said, what? I said, because I've been praying for months about an answer, and you've just given me the answer. And I say, yes, I will come. I didn't know anything about the polity, the doctrine of the United Methodist Church. I learned as I went. But it was a wonderful few years of ministry there, and then it progressed on until I was told that, and that was in Radford, Virginia, if you know where that is. I received a call after those 5 years in the Methodist Church, that I would be moved, as Methodists often do, to a place called Hiltons, Virginia. And I said, where's that? Because I never had heard of it. It turns out it was the little community near Macy Springs where the Carter family all lived, and the country music got its start there in so many ways with the Carter family. So I was called to pastor the church where the Carter family was buried and where their children and grandchildren were members. And so I was able to stay in that community for 10 years, meet a lot of people, meet people that I would have never been able to know. And I had a wonderful ministry. During that time, I received an award through the United Methodist Church called the Denman Award for Evangelism. And that's a very select presentation. It's only given once every year at each annual conference to one person. And I was given that, which really encouraged me to keep going, that I know I'm in the right place. And then after 10 years, they said, why don't you just, like Moses and the 3 disciples on top of the mountain, they said, why don't you just let us build you a house here, and you just stay here in these mountains and just be here from now on. Of course, I knew that wasn't God's plan, and in the Methodist Church it doesn't work that way either. So I told the bishop I was ready to go, and was sent to Kingsport to a congregation of all places called Boozy Creek, and spent 5 good years in that place. But during this whole time, there was something just inside of my heart propelling me, pushing me, pulling me, tugging me to storefront ministry. I had even expressed that to my bishop at the time and to other leaders in the United Methodist Church, that there's something more that I'm supposed to be doing than just pastoring a church. And I know in the United Methodist tradition, John Wesley always said, the world is my parish. And by this time, I had been able to travel in over 40 countries of the world. I'd done ministry in several countries, a lot of missions work, and also worked in an inner city in South Florida, in Miami. And so at this point in time, I just thought, I'm ready for something else. And we prayed, I prayed, I expressed my desire, and a whole lot didn't come of it. Until finally, in 2013, like the fire shut up in your bones that we read about. Well, the fire had gotten pretty hot. And I just thought, I'm at a crossroads. So I went to my district superintendent, who of course is in contact with the bishop and the cabinet. And I said, God is calling me to begin a storefront ministry. I don't know what that all means here, but I know that in Florida and other places I have started storefront churches in years past. But I said, I need to do this. And I'd worked hard over the years to go through the proper seminary courses and go through the system, become an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, which is really the highest level that a minister can attain in the United Methodist ranks. So I had gone as far as I could go in that, which would have helped me to go into any United Methodist Church, wherever I had been called. But I finally told my district superintendent, this is what I'm going to do. I have to start a church. And if the bishop doesn't approve it, and if you don't approve it, I will give back to you my credentials, all of my paperwork, all of my things that I've achieved over these years, and I will do this alone. I will do it with God's help because I have to do it. And they believed in me because, of course, I had received some of the honors in the United Methodist Church over the years for evangelism and church growth. And they said, if you feel that strong about what God is calling you to do, we can't stand in your way. And so in 2014, in the month of June, I was appointed by the bishop and the cabinet of the Holston Annual Conference to the streets of Kingsport, Tennessee, without a congregation and without a building. And to my knowledge and to the knowledge of the people at that time who were in charge of all of this, said we have never appointed someone to just to the streets like this. We're not sure what we're appointing you to, except we know that you said you got to do it. But I'm so thankful that they believed in me. And it's so important that we believe in one another. And I'm often telling people, pastors, lay people, whomever, listen to the voices of the younger people, even older people. Listen to the voices when folks say, this is what God is calling me to do, because they will be able to discern for themselves better than I or you or anyone else, although we may be able to spot their gifts and the fruits of their ministry. So thanks be to God, I was appointed to the streets of Kingsport, and I said, I'll take it. And so we stepped out totally on faith, but that truly just confirmed everything that God was already telling me, because I knew that God in God's mind already had Shades of Grace going. It was already a real ministry in the mind of God. And in my mind, I was willing to see it come to pass. But we looked around while we were searching for a church. For the month of July, we met in Mayfair United Methodist Church, which is just a couple of blocks away from here, maybe a couple of miles, I guess. And that very first Sunday afternoon that we met in their basement for a service, we had 78 people, but our offering was $11,000 in the offering plates. And people came and they said, we've been saving money for a year, and we didn't know why, but God just said, put a little money back and save it. And God was preparing their hearts. There's a word in the Wesleyan tradition, the Methodist Church and holiness churches, called prevenient grace. There's justifying grace, sanctifying grace. There's all kinds of grace. There's grace upon grace that Paul talks about, but there's also prevenient grace, which means God going before us, planning ahead, and then walking beside us through it. So during that time, we only met there for about 11 weeks, and the crowd stayed around 80 to 90 people, and the offerings continued to just flow in. God gave me the name Shades of Grace as I was driving out by the airport one day in the summer. It was stormy, a dark, rainy, cloudy day, and I came through a thunderstorm, and all of a sudden the bright sunlight just enveloped my car. And the biggest rainbow you've ever seen, I was right in the middle of it. And I heard those little, still, small voice words in my mind, not out loud, but I just heard those three words, Shades of Grace. And I knew nobody had to convince me, nobody had to argue with me. I said, it's done. And so I was advised not to use that name. I was told, well, why can't you just call it Grace Chapel, or just call it, anything but Shades of Grace? I said, because God said Shades of Grace, and I believe that to this day. And with what we know, how could it be anything but Shades of Grace? Because from the time we met in October at 313 East Sullivan Street, the first day we opened that building up, 200 people came into our doors. And we were not prepared for that. I was not prepared for that. God just said, do it. And so for the first 3 years, every bit of transaction of business, everything was done on a paper calendar and my cell phone. That's it. We didn't have a secretary. We didn't have a desk for a secretary to sit at. We were just so busy doing ministry in hand and on site that we were just flying by, the seat of the pants, as the saying goes. We were just doing ministry. And we started feeding meals 3 times a day. We didn't know better. We've learned a whole lot since those first months of ministry. But God had said, do not ever sell anything. Do not ever solicit anything. And to this day, a little over 10 years later, we have never had a finance committee meeting, and we have never asked for a special offering from anybody. And even to this day, in our services, we never mention money. There's a box hanging on the wall and a basket sitting by the altar, and money is never mentioned. But God provides in every way. But the homeless folks came in and we made them feel welcome. We put no restrictions. We didn't allow any labels on anybody. God said all people, all means all without exception, are invited and welcome in my house. And as people begin to come in, they begin talking like, I feel like I'm at home. I feel like I'm in a living room. I just feel at peace here. We just started calling it God's living room. And to this day, you know, we've got a great big plaque hanging on the wall that says God's living room. There's a little pen there. You can write your name or your prayer request or whatever. And so we were feeding 3 meals a day, and then we realized that we shouldn't be trying to reinvent anything that's already going on in the city. And so we realized quickly that Salvation Army served meals at their appropriate time. We weren't trying to reinvent the wheel, it's just that we had a zeal. We were so eager and excited, and we didn't know really too much about what we were doing. You know, God was in control. But we learned a lot of those things. And we did serve meals in the building. We became a temporary day center, really, for the downtown area for several years. And you've been there when that was going on. The building was full of people going and coming all day long. It was a hub of ministry. Agencies would come there, Veterans Association, social services, you name it, would come and say, can we set up a table and just meet with people? Because here's where the people are who we need to help. And so we did that, and then the pandemic came, and we quickly had to shut down the way we're doing things. And so due to our wonderful volunteers, and I can't go on without talking about all the volunteers that we have and have served during these 10 years. We couldn't have done it by ourselves. We could not have done it. We've had volunteers from every denomination, every civic organization that you could think of has supported us and continues to support us.